This is Maurice Hamovitch, and I am talking with Honora Wilson as part of the oral history for the California Social Welfare Archives, as well as for the 75th anniversary of the USC School of Social Work. Honora has prepared some material which she will read, and we will interrupt as we go along. And so we'll take it from there. Honora?
Okay. This material is related that I prepared at this point in time is a little bit about myself personally, and then how I happened to go to the USC School of Social Work. I was born in New York City, and I moved with my parents to Los Angeles in 1913. I have lived here all my life, with the exception of 10 years when I lived in Cincinnati. That was from 1937 until 1947, when I returned to Los Angeles, and have been here ever since. I entered the University of California, Berkeley, in the fall of 1927. I was 17 years old. My mother, who herself was a graduate of USC, she was the first woman to graduate from the USC School of Pharmacy. My mother insisted that I must have a profession so that I could support myself if anything happened to my husband. Being a teacher was considered appropriate. While in Berkeley, I met a young woman, a college graduate, who lived in Alameda with her parents. This was a very interesting family. They were Austrian Jews, and her father had a successful plumbing business. Josephine Feldhammer, who had a bachelor from Berkeley, taught English at night school in Berkeley, and usually visited me at night because I was living in a boarding house. And on the way home from teaching school, she would come and see me. Her father was president of the Jewish community in Alameda, and he had secured for her the job of social worker for the poor Jewish people. She was the first social worker I ever in my life met or knew. Well, that's not true. I had volunteered during the summer at Jewish Family Service, that's true, and I knew Frieda Mohr.
That's Jewish Family Service in Los Angeles.
Well, Josephine Feldhammer was maybe 4 or 5 years older than I, but she was very protective of me, and she right away insisted that I become a social worker, and she never let go. She was kind and firm, and knew everybody in the Jewish community of Alameda and every poor family. She kept on telling me that I should not pay attention to be a teacher, because the most important profession was that of social work. When I graduated from college, I returned to Los Angeles, and I spent the summer months driving around applying for a job teaching. And I drove all over Southern California. This was the height of the Depression, and I interviewed every head of every school from Santa Monica, from Santa Barbara to San Diego, and they just said they had no jobs. They weren't even sure they were going to be able to pay the teachers they had.
Excuse me, what year was this?
This was 1931.
31.
So I decided that with my parents that I would go to graduate school because there was nothing else to do. And I had never worked, so the thought of getting a job as a waitress or working commercially never occurred to me. I came from that kind of a family. Mm-hmm. I think my family would have gone into, if I ever gone to a job like many other families did, working in a restaurant and so forth, that they would consider that very humiliating. Mm-hmm. That just was the culture from which I came. So in the fall, and USC was familiar to me because my mother went to the school of the pharmacy school when she was an adult, and I went to my mother's college graduation.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So USC, we were very involved with USC. So in the fall, I decided to go to USC and to get graduate training. And I decided that I would take graduate training in the School of Education and also in the School of Social Work. And it's just this typical of my personality. I want to make it safe, one way or the other. This was the fall of 1931. And I don't remember very much, but I had this picture in my mind, this large room with large tables where you registered. And I went over to the School of Education and I registered there. And then I went over to the School of Social Work. And Dr. Earl Young was sitting at the table. And I talked to him briefly, and he started taking my registration. And I said, well, I went over, he said, where were you before? And I said, I went over to the School of Education. And he was a wonderful, magnificent, gentle man, And he said, you got to make up your mind one thing or the other. You got to be either a school teacher or a social worker. Well, incidentally, I made some notes about them. His wife was also a PhD social worker.
Pauline Young.
Pauline Young. And she had done, as you probably know, the great research on the Russian Mountains. And I knew about that. And I've known that group, and I have known them ever since. And one of my closest friends is married to a nurse that I know from Rancho. And her husband comes from that whole Russian Moluccan group, and he was born and raised in Boyle Heights. And her dissertation, as you know, is a masterpiece. This is Pauline Young. You knew them?
Yes. I mean, I came in 1949. They were still around. And we used Pauline Young's book as a text in research.
I bet you did. At any rate, and I make some notes about what that was about, that study that she did. Well, Dr. Young said to me, and Earl was a wonderful man. I had a class with him. He just was a warm, friendly. I always remember him. He knew how to live economically better than anybody I ever knew.
Excuse me, could talk just a little louder, please.
Dr. Earl Young knew how to live economically better than anybody ever knew. He taught me a lot of things about how to shop and never to eat cold. I remember this literally, never to eat cold cereals because they didn't have any food value. And this is how many, 60 years ago he knew this. He was this way. Anyway, he said, okay, I could become a social worker. I could go to both schools, which I did. And I didn't stay much longer than, at the most, 6 months if I stayed that long. I wasn't interested. I just was a natural for the School of Social Work, for social work and the people there. The School of Education wasn't for me, and I just dropped out. How I got into the School of Social Work is that when Earl Young said to me that make up your mind one way or the other, well, I wrote in my notes, I had learned how to manage myself in order to get what I wanted. So I started crying. And I can see myself, I'm 21 years old and I weigh 93 pounds and there I am. And I started crying and Earl Young said, okay, you can be a social worker. He couldn't take it. So I was assigned to, the Welfare Department was called the Bureau of Indigent Relief. Do you remember that? That's the name. And Genevieve Kelly, who was also a graduate of the School of Social Work, had the district where the students were, and she supervised all the social work students for the county. And Dr. Bogardus was the chairman of the Department of Sociology, and he was a brilliant, warm kind of man. I didn't have very much to do with him. And Dr. Vincent was a professor in the Department of Sociology, and I had a class with him. This school taught sociology. It was sociological. It was an offshoot of the Department of Sociology, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. I had a course in sociology, sociological theory from Dr. Vincent. He was always very nice to me. Well, all the students that were in the welfare department were in Miss Kelly's district. And Dr. Bessie McClenahan was our casework teacher. And she was a warm, friendly, remarkable person. Everything was sort of informal, and we used to have various group discussions and meetings at night at various persons' homes, sometimes in mine and sometimes in another student's home.
Excuse me, Nora. How many students would there have been in the school at the time, full-time, or full or part-time students at the time?
I wouldn't remember.
I mean, like, well, in your how large were the classes? Like
About 10 or 12. I would tell you, we were a phenomenon because this was the height of the Depression, and very shortly, the money
and we're talking about her experiences, her employment experiences.
Is this the third tape? Oh, the second tape?
Second tape, the third side.
Anyway, I told my mother that I was only half-baked. I had been a student for a year, and I had to have a work experience in one of those agencies like they had in the East. They were simply not advanced enough here in Los Angeles. And the professional education that I had gotten at Smith wouldn't stand me instead if I didn't have work experience with proper supervision in those days. And here, too, you always want to have good supervision. So at any rate, my mother agreed, which was very difficult for her because by this time my family had been wiped out and they were dependent upon me. And anyway, and I told Frieda Mohr, who never forgave me, that I had to leave her and go back to Cincinnati, Ohio. And I did. And I returned to Cincinnati, and there I met my supervisor's husband's best friend. And I began dating him, and I married him, and I stayed in Cincinnati until my husband died of acute leukemia. So
he died of what?
Acute leukemia. They couldn't have done anything. They didn't know how to do anything then, but they couldn't diagnose it anyway. 1946, 47. Yeah, it's 1946, 47. So I stayed there until 1947. And then, and I would come back once or twice to the conferences to see my family and so forth. But I returned to Los Angeles, and I could always get a job in a family agency because they all wanted me because I had worked in this very distinguished. The great family agencies were United Charities of Chicago, the CSS of New York, St. Louis Family Service, and Cincinnati Family Service, at least in that era. And by this time, I knew the leadership of the Family Service Bureau. My professional life has been split. Half of it was in family agencies, and the rest of it was in medical, which is another group. I long ago left the Family Service Bureau, but I was in the non-sectarian Family Service Bureau. So I went back, and I went to a conference, and I got interviewed by the executive of Family Service in Los Angeles, and I got offered a job, and I returned to Los Angeles with a job in my hand, working for Family Service in Los Angeles, and I was the district director of the 3 southeast districts of Family Service: Bell, Huntington Park, and the third one out there. Bell, Huntington Park, and so I worked for Blythe Francis, who was the executive of Family Service. And I stayed there for a couple of years. That's all, because it was a very serious financial problem. The social workers in Los Angeles who worked for Jewish agencies got better paid than any other social workers because with the community chest and what else was going on, the social worker, the salaries were kept low in the non-Jewish agencies, but the Jewish social workers were all unionized, so they got a supplement from the Federation money. And I was trying to raise a child by myself, and it was too hard. So I was trying to get a job working for one of the Jewish agencies, or I figured that's where I ought to go. Family Service of Los Angeles was wonderful to me and liked me very much, and I liked them. But I figured I might as well go over there where I can make more money. So I got a job working for the Jewish Committee for Personal Service and Gateways. And that's where I developed my friendship with Lou Ziskin, the Ziskin family. And I was the assistant director. Well, this leads me to the City of Hope. And I wrote this. The City of Hope provided me a rare opportunity. It came accidentally, but at a critical time for me and the hospital. I had gone to Smith, received a master's degree there, and returned to L.A. I was assistant to Lou Ziskin, who was the executor of Gateways and the Jewish Committee for Personal Service. Mr. Carter was president of the City of Hope and of our agency. He was president of two agencies, and he was a distinguished citizen in the Jewish community and a multimillionaire, at least at one time. The City of Hope had had difficulty with the director of social work, and they had fired him cold. The board of the City of Hope then was very different as now. It was composed primarily of lower-caste Jewish men who had worked themselves up and had become millionaires, many of them in the shoe business, two at least in the shoe business. Mr. Sullivan, they were wonderful people. Mr. Sullivan's son was one of the most distinguished Americans, became one of the most distinguished American children's psychiatrists. And his father used to always say to me, from a shoemaker comes a psychiatrist, which is typical of Jews. And so they had this trouble with the previous director who said to them, if you fire me, I will see to it that no professional social worker will ever walk the floors of the City of Hope again. This was in the days of liberal, communist, I don't know, militancy. So that's all you had to do was hear these men who were working class men who had moved up and became millionaires. They weren't going to let any little snot-nosed social worker take them on. So Mr. Carter was the president of the City of Hope and also president of the Gateways Hospital and the Jewish Committee for Personal Service. And he went to Lou Ziskin, who was the executive, and said, I don't care what you do, but you get the best qualified, credentialed social worker for us. Because this guy said that they'd fix it so they couldn't. So Lou Ziskin, who liked me very much, but had to do with Mr. Carter, came to me and said, Honora, they need a social worker over there at the City of Hope. And I said, well, what's that got to do with me? He said, I want you to go over there and apply. I said, look, I don't know anything about working in the hospital. I never worked in the hospital. It's a tuberculosis hospital. I have a little boy. And he said, you don't have to take the job. You don't have to at all. But Mr. Carter said I should send some applicants over there. You know how it is when you have a president. You have to do what he tells you to do. I said, all right, you want me to do it? All right, I'll go and apply. So they own the building at 8th and Hill Street. They still do. And I went down there, and there was this little teeny man, uncomfortable as heck, sitting in this great big office. I knew. And I sat there. I'm fancy. I went to Smith. I'm this fancy psychiatric social worker. You could count them on one hand in Los Angeles in 1936. I have this wonderful education. And this guy doesn't even know how to interview me. He doesn't ask me where I went to school, what my education is, what I have done. He just sat there and talked. And I got pissed, literally, even if it is on tape. I was annoyed. I came down here and I don't know what happened to me. I knew he was so uncomfortable, he didn't know what to ask me. He was talking about the weather. And for some reason or other, I decided, you know what? I'm going to get this guy to eat out of my hands. So I said, Mr. Faberman, why don't you tell me about yourself? And he didn't know how to talk to me. He said, oh, yes. He told me that he was a pharmacist. And he had a chain of drugstores in San Francisco. And that he really was the lay president, and he didn't know. And they asked him to come down and do some things for them, and he really didn't know what to do or how to do. And I thought, that's very funny. My mother is a pharmacist. If I had said that my mother was his sister, he couldn't have gotten more excited. He came around in the chair and said, come here, I want to tell you something. You ask whatever you want, you'll get it. They're dying to hire you. Whatever you want, you can have. Your mother's a pharmacist, and I'm a pharmacist. The job is yours right here and now.
That is funny.
It's a wonderful story. So anyway, I went out. I said, well, there are certain rules. It happened that I knew a social worker from Cincinnati who had been hired by the National Tuberculosis Association, the first social worker they ever hired to do a community organization job. I said, I can't go work to a TB hospital unless I find out something about it. So anyway, I called her up long distance. She said, oh, it would be marvelous. Frances Beard, you mean to tell me that you're going to go work for the City of Hope and they'll have a professional social worker like you and our, oh, we'll stand behind you. This is New York to Los Angeles. We'll do everything there is for you. You could, I said, well, I don't know. Tell somebody to tell me whether I can go and, well, I don't want my son to get TB. She got the medical director to talk to me and everybody. And she said, I said, do you think I should go work for that place, that City of Hope? Oh, she said, we'll be so proud of it. She's just practically sold me that. Because I thought that was a low-down socialist Jews, you know, I don't know. You know, Michelle's take that. So she said, go, and I'll do everything I can to help you. So I went out to the hospital, and I met Dr. Rogers, the medical director, and he said to me, look, I'm going to tell you something. They're all on pins and needles, Mr. Carter and everybody else. They're so worried that you won't take the job. You can have anything you want. But I'm just telling you how they are. Anyway, he said, Victor Carter is just pacing in another part of the hospital up and down to be sure that you accept the job. So they gave me, I made a good deal. I could have had more. I got a budget for three social workers. I got an expense account for myself that I had for the whole 10 years. No social worker. I got paid $865, which was a lot of money for those days. But I got they paid for my car, my mileage, everything I could think of, they gave me. And Luziskin said, it's okay. He said, when are you going to grow up, Honora? You always look for somebody to supervise you. This is an opportunity for you to be I remember like today. You don't want to grow up and be an executive and do what's the hard part, but you're long past, what am I? In my early 30s, late 30s. You're long past having to look for a supervisor to protect you and so forth and so on. Grow up and become an executive. So I agreed. I went downtown. I came to the City of Hope. I had two professional social workers. I began with that. And they were wonderful for me because the board was composed mostly of Russian Jewish working men who became millionaires, who had this great empathy for people. And I knew culturally that background. Mm-hmm. I came from that kind of a family, and they loved that in me. And they had, it's all written down here, but it's funny, they had an admissions committee, because it was an old-fashioned TB hospital. Mm-hmm. They had an admissions committee. That was a committee of the board. And they reviewed all the cases. The doctors had nothing to do with it. They took whatever they gave them. Mm-hmm. And they reviewed all the applicants to the hospital and decided who should come in, because it was a free hospital. Mm-hmm. And I said, Dr. Rogers, this is ridiculous. This is a hospital. They treat people. Doctors do. Lay people can't decide who has tuberculosis and who should come here. That has to be, he said, I know it. And I said, why don't you do something about it? He said, I can't. That's been here for a long time. They founded this hospital. They did. They were all, and I can't take away from them. I said, well, I'm going to tell you something. If I come here, I'm going to change that. Because I don't believe in that. I think that the decision of who should be treated by this hospital is a medical decision. And it isn't the decision of these people, they don't know. Anyway, the first, a very darling young girl who had worked in the Cook County Hospital and was working then for another agency, but who was very pretty and very bright. I had a master's from the University of Chicago School of Social Work. I never hired anybody that didn't have the right ticket. But it was post-polio. And she wore a brace. And this beautiful girl, and anybody that looked at her and then saw that brace just would melt. So she came out to Dworak, and I hired her, and we were the girls. And once a month, this committee met. Well, in the first place, there was me, and then there was Shirley, who was so pretty and had wore this brace. And here were these elderly Jewish men who just loved us. And Shirley, and we would tell the case stories, and they just would melt, And they all loved it. We were met at Mr. Carl was the Carl shoe store, multi-millionaire. And he was the chairman of the Social Service Committee. And the whole board envied them because they could hear all these stories and be with the girls. That's us. And I could have had diamond rings, figuratively, anything I wanted, because they had me with my master's degree.
Well, this is Shirley Walters.
Yeah.
Yes, I know her.
Yes, you do. Yeah, I'll tell you about it first. And this was a great job for her. She went from there to Children's to Orthopedic Hospital and so on. She would have been stuck I don't know where. But we were the girls who sang. There wasn't any question. We could have anything we wanted. You got raises, you got, we didn't get more than you were supposed to get.
Your voice is dropping again.
Didn't get more than you were supposed to get, but, And I made Shirley assistant director to me, and from there she went to that. So we became a team, and I told Dr. Rogers that I had to get rid of their reviewing who comes into the hospital. I wrote about it. We met once a month at usually Mr. Carl's house, and I never forgot when the first night we were there, he went to the administration and got my background, and he introduced me as if I was the Queen of England with my background. He was so dear, wonderful family. And they had great respect, and they were, everybody on the regular board, there was only the admissions committee, were so envious of them because they had the two girls, two pretty girls, and they learned all the stuff from us about the patients. And then anyway, well, then I came at a very particular time when they were in the process, tuberculosis was dying out because the drugs had been discovered. And they had hired Dr. Howard Bierman, who was instrumental in developing their cancer program, and then we got to develop the parent participation program. And I decided that, I eventually, within less than 2 years' time, got rid of that committee. But I had the committee, so I would report to them. The medical director never went to a board meeting, but I did. I got so much power in that hospital that it came from the circumstances of how I got the job and what happened in my personality, that it wasn't funny. Everybody knew about the program we developed. So then I thought, well, we ought to have a research program. You're going to be a good social work department. You had to have a good research program. And we had the grant participation program. So, did you write the grant? So, and I knew about you, and you know what happened. And, that was an exciting time because I always remember when the site team came out, everybody was hiding to see whether they were going to come, whether they were going to like us, and so forth and so on. And I was dancing around. And then we got the grant. And you still have the book? I saved it. Mr. Golder was the famous. What time is it?
It's 5 to 11.
Was the famous.
Okay, it's not picking up at this point. No, your reference to that research project, that's when I first met you.
Yes.
And I remember Dr. Bierman calling me into his office to tell me about you and your role in the hospital.
Oh, did he?
And just very, very, very praiseworthy.
Oh, really?
And he said she's a tough cookie, and she makes us do things that we wouldn't do on our own, but she is our conscience, and she holds us to it, and we love her for it. But,
really?
Yeah. So it was a very interesting, and it made me feel so good because I wasn't used to hospital directors liking their social work directors. That isn't the way most of them operated.
Well,
but you had that respect that you got from you're talking a long time later, 10, 15 years later, still held.
Well, that's interesting because that goes back to USC. You see, the fundraisers had to raise money. And they said, there's one place where we could get the names of all the relatives and we could put, this was a free hospital and they sold it on that basis. But they had to get money by hook or by crook. And they said, we get a hold of the social worker, we'll get all the names of all the relatives. And I said, over my dead body. And that's partly what he...
Let me stop this a second. Sorry.
So I said, the records are confidential. I don't care where you want to raise your money, but you can't get it from you can't get the names of the relatives from, and he knew this, because they went to Howard Bierman, no sweat off his brow if I gave him the records, and he knew that, and so it was, there never was any violation of the records, the social work records. And there wasn't anything in the medical records about the name of all the relatives, except for, who to call if you're in trouble, but nothing else. So that there is no way that they could get the data that I had. The administration, the fundraiser could not get the name because the social work department would not violate confidentiality. And it goes right back to USC. And I had no ambivalence about this. They knew nothing could make me do that. It would be like, I don't know what. I had a wonderful time there. I was there 10 years. They, I don't know what's happened, but they're different. And no director of social work ever had the kind of power I did. It grew out of that whole early experience. They're losing their director and their emotional involvement with me and mine with them and the history and all the rest of it. Because I went to board meetings and I had my own committee. The medical director never had anything to do with them. They didn't want doctors to tell them what to do. Just like I developed, I came to them and said, this is a Jewish hospital, and people stay here for months and months at a time in those times, and you don't have a rabbi here. We got to have a rabbi. They said, if I said we got to have something, they said okay, but they said, you want to have a rabbi? I said, yeah, it's a Jewish hospital, and these people stay here for months, and they want to have some kind of religious Jewish experience with that. So I used to do a Passover Seder for everybody. I sponsored it, and I developed it. And they said, do you want a rabbi? You could have a rabbi, but you have to have one agreement with us that he won't go near the kitchen. Because, those Russian Jews, were not religious. It's Reform Judaism has changed everybody now, if they weren't. But we don't want to be bothered with that, because they had a Mexican man who was the cook, and they didn't want the rabbi. I said to the rabbi, you can have this job. I hired him. He was the rabbi of the Foothill Jewish community rabbi, and he was a Reformed rabbi now, but he originally was Orthodox. And I said, you cannot go near the kitchen. He said, I don't want to go near the kitchen. So we had a rabbi. Only years later did Cedars finally get themselves a rabbi. And of course, they've got a psychiatric rabbi now, and they have a whole psychiatric religion and religion and medicine. This is non-profit, but that's how we got the rabbi there. So that was a wonderful experience. It was right for me to leave, but I left because it was a benevolent paternalist. It isn't that way anymore now, I'm sure. I don't know. But I left because I got to be 50 years old, and all I had was my salary. I didn't have a pot anyway, and they didn't have a retirement program. They said, don't worry, we'll take care of you. And this was not enough for me. I couldn't go and say, don't worry, I'd have to go with all those boys. In the first place, if you were a girl in a hospital, you were being propositioned every day all the time anyway.
Uh-huh.
So I could not run the risk of having to sit on somebody's lap or beg them for my old age. And I warned them that I stayed 10 years. So I went back to the Jewish Federation, and they were way behind in doing anything on the agent. So they decided they had to do a community organization job on me, and I became the executive of the Jewish Information Service for the agent. I stayed with them for 2 years until that died out, and then I knew I had to go to some public sector that had a good retirement program. So then I went to there too. Then I went after 2 years as executive of the Jewish Information Service for the agent, which was an agency which is a federation-sponsored agency, and I went all over the United States and reviewed all the programs for the elderly and wrote them an outline or a thing about what they needed to do to develop programs for the elderly in the Jewish community. Then I, of course, went to Rancho, and then because I had to work for a public agency, because they're the ones that have the good retirement programs. You have a good one at USC?
Yes.
And that worked out okay, and I couldn't sit around waiting for the City of Hope. City of Hope had unions, you see, for lower echelon workers, and they had retirement and Social Security. I got Social Security at the City of Hope. Then I went to Rancho, and that was great. I was there for almost 15 years.
How long was it? 15 years?
I went to Rancho, 12, I think. Something like that. I went to Rancho in 62, 13 years I was there. Plus that with my early county gave me plenty of time in the retirement program. And that worked out very well. Rancho was a wonderful experience. So I became medical social worker.
Right. As I knew in advance, as I told you, I knew this was going to be fascinating.
Really?
And your story, I mean, both personal and professional, and in terms of the history of social work in this community. So I really appreciate this very, very much. And I think what you demonstrated was the power that a professional, a truly professional social worker with convictions and a strong ego can accomplish. Because when you think about how poor so many social work departments and hospitals are and have been, the ones where stand out. And it's not just a question of the time, of the period, but yourself, and then you have Frieda Mohr at the Jewish Family Service. You had Shirley Waters, and she learned from you, and she applied it to orthopedic hospital. And then there was Jean Young, I think, at County for a while. At Cedars. And now, more recently, we have June Simmons at Huntington did a terrific job.
She's not
there too. She's not there anymore.
No.
She's head of the VNA now.
She's a really top person.
Right. But all of you have that characteristic in common, as far as I'm concerned. And it's great. But obviously you were, and that's great. And thank you very much.
Yeah, well, thank you. I'm interested that Howard